The last thing he remembered was a flat tire and a cliff. A crash. Darkness. He knew for certain he shouldn't have survived. And now he's sitting in black, poisonous mud. Above him, two men in medieval armor are reading out a sentence of lifelong exile, and they're calling him by a name he's hearing for the first time. Lord Daniel Ashford, convicted of insolence toward Prince Albrecht, exiled to the lands of Mornwald with no right of return. The guard rolls up the scroll. The second one tosses a sack of coarse cloth at his feet. A rusty axe follows. Then a loaf of bread. It splashes into the mud and darkens with moisture. One of them says that if he survives until winter, they'll pray for him. Both turn and walk away. They don't even look back. Daniel sits down. He wipes his face with a stranger's sleeve. The shirt is coarse. Linen, not his. The pants are someone else's. The boots are 2 sizes too big. He looks at his hands. And here's the first oddity. The calluses on his palms are his own. The very same ones. From pruning shears and a shovel. 30 years of work have etched themselves into his skin. But the body is young. Younger than he remembers. He clenches his fist and unclenches it. Everything works. He's alive. Even though the car definitely plunged off the cliff. He clearly remembers the impact and the smell of earth from the overturned pots of seedlings. And now he's sitting in a dead forest, and 2 people in armor have just read him someone else's fate. He looks around. The trees are gray, twisted. Not a leaf, not a trace of bark. The trunks are covered with dry bark. And silence. Thick. It presses on his ears. Not a bird, not a beetle, not a rustle. He scoops up a handful of dirt, rubs it between his fingers, brings it to his nose. And the smell hits him right away. Metallic, sour, with a hint of sulfur. He knows that smell. Heavy metals, lead, maybe arsenic. The earth is dead. Dead for a long time. For 30 years, he'd learned to tell the difference between living soil and dead soil in a split second. This soil has been dead for a very long time. He opens the bag. A rope, a flint, a tin mug, a palm-sized piece of dried meat, twine, a small knife. That's all he's been left with to survive. He stands up. His legs hold him steady. His head is clear. He picks up the axe, checks the blade. Dull but serviceable. He hides the bread in the bag. He slings the bag over his shoulder, and he walks. Not because he knows where he's going, but because there's no point in standing in a dead forest. He needs water. Clean water. The first thing a living being needs, and the first thing the earth needs to begin to recover. He walks for an hour. The forest doesn't change. It crunches under his feet. He bends down. Bones. Small ones. Bird bones. Lying right in the soil, as if the animals had simply fallen and died. Not from a predator, from the earth itself. Poisoning. Mass poisoning. Long term. He'd seen this twice before on Earth. An abandoned factory in Ohio. An old mine in Montana. There he spent 3 years bringing 1.5 hectares back to life. Here, the entire forest is dead as far as the eye can see. But the principle is the same. Always the same. Find the source of the poison. Stop it. Let the earth breathe. Let the water flow. Nature will take care of the rest. 2 hours later, he hears water. He follows the sound. He finds a stream. The water is dark, with an oily sheen. He crouches down. There's a reddish coating on the rocks, iron oxide, and something else. Under the water, the rocks are covered in black slime. Not algae, a bacterial film, the kind that grows in high concentrations of metals. It's undrinkable. He walks upstream. Half a kilometer further on, he finds it. A thick black sludge oozing from beneath the roots of a huge dead tree. a pungent smell. The tree has been lying there for 30 years. The roots stick out like twisted fingers. Most of the mud is coming from beneath them. He digs with his knife. At the depth of a palm, the soil changes color. It turns gray with green veins. And here's the most interesting part: the green veins. He's never seen anything like this before. Not mold, not a mineral. Something alien. Something that belongs to this world. He straightens up. He looks at the dead forest, at the poisoned stream, at his hands. The hands of a gardener. The hands of a man who spent 30 years learning to heal the earth. He was cast out here to die. That much is obvious. No normal person would last even a week here. But he isn't a normal person. He's a soil scientist. And right now, he's standing before the most difficult patient of his life. He takes off the sack, picks up an axe, chops dead branches for a fire. 3 hours until dark. He needs a fire. He needs shelter. And in the morning, the real work will begin. He finds a niche in the trunk of a giant dead oak. He gathers branches. A spark flies on the third strike. The dry branches flare up quickly. He sits down by the fire. He breaks off a quarter of a loaf of bread. Stale, sour, but it's food. He chews and thinks. First, water. Clear at least one section of the stream downstream from the spring. Sand, charcoal, moss, reeds. He saw living reeds along the road. So not everything here is dead. That means there are pockets of life. That's very good. Second, food. Enough bread for 2 days, enough meat for 1 day. After that, he'll have to find more on his own. Third, shelter. Fourth, figure out what those green streaks are. That might be the key to everything. He finishes his bread. He lies down by the fire. The forest is silent, a deathly stillness. But Daniel Ashford isn't afraid. He's seen dead places before, and he knows that none of them stays dead forever, if there's someone to work at it. He falls asleep, and from a high branch 100 meters behind him, 2 eyes are watching him, unblinking. Inhuman. Their owner has been sitting motionless for 4 hours now. She saw him come, how he sniffed the ground, how he touched the water, how he dug. People have been brought here for a long time. Usually they do one of 2 things. They run back south, or they lie down and die. This one did neither. He started digging. A scout from the Silvara clan named Siren Tiel squints. She's been watching people in this forest for 130 years, and none of them had ever sniffed the ground before. The morning began with a chill. The fire had burned out by dawn, and Daniel woke up to the sound of his teeth chattering. He sat up. He stretched his neck. He looked around. The forest looked even worse in the daylight. Gray tree trunks stretched out in all directions like gravestones. The ground beneath his feet was damp and cold. He stood up, stretched, ate a piece of jerky the size of 2 fingers, put the rest away. He had 2 tasks today. First, find live reeds by the swamp and gather the rhizomes. Second, start building a filter by the stream. He returned to the stream in 20 minutes. In daylight, the water looked even worse. An oily film shimmered on the surface with a dull rainbow. The reddish film on the rocks was thick and porous. Daniel retraced his steps back to the spot where he'd spotted the reeds yesterday. He walked for about 40 minutes. He found it. A small marsh in a low-lying area, about 30 meters across. The water here was different. Not clear, but alive. Something was moving in it. Small, like larvae. Reeds grew along the edges, short, thin, but alive, with green stems. It was the first truly living plant he'd seen in this forest. He crouched down. He examined the roots. The reed's root system was dense and branched, just what he needed. Reed is a natural filter. Its roots absorb heavy metals from the water. They concentrate them in their tissues. They purify the stream. On Earth, this is called phytoremediation. Here, it would be called a miracle. He began to dig, with his knife and his hands, carefully, trying not to damage the root system. He dug up 6 clumps of reeds with clods of earth attached. He placed them on a piece of fabric from the sack. He dragged them back to the stream. The journey took over an hour. The bushes were heavy with wet soil. By noon, he was at the stream. He chose a spot, about 20 meters downstream from the point of contamination. Here, the bank was gentle and the soil was relatively soft. He could dig. He began digging a bypass channel. The idea was simple. Don't touch the main channel. Divert some of the water to the side through a channel filled with layers of filtering material. Sand at the bottom, then charcoal, then moss, then reeds on top. The water passes through all the layers and comes out on the other side much cleaner. On Earth, structures like this can be built in a day. Here, he had no shovel, just a rusty hatchet, a small knife, and his hands. He dug until dark. He dug a channel 5 meters long, knee-deep. His hands were covered in blood. His fingernails were broken. His back ached so much that he could barely straighten up. But the channel was there. The foundation had been laid. He returned to the oak tree. He built a fire. He ate the last piece of meat. He had enough bread to last 2 days. After that, his food would be gone. He lay down by the fire. He closed his eyes. He thought about how he'd have to find charcoal tomorrow, burn the wood in the fire, gather it, grind it up, and find moss, live moss for a filter. Saren watched from the same tree. The man had been digging all day, alone, without magic, without help. He was simply digging a ditch by the stream. She didn't understand why. For the 2nd day in a row, he hadn't prayed. He hadn't called for help. He hadn't tried to escape. He was working. It was strange. The next 3 days blurred into a single streak of mud and aching muscles. Daniel burned dead branches in a fire until they turned to embers. He gathered the charcoal. He crushed it with stones. He dug the channel further. He found moss. Not where he expected. The moss grew on the north side of a large boulder half a kilometer from the stream. A thin layer, but alive and dense. He peeled it off carefully, like a surgeon removes a bandage. Every scrap was precious. On the 4th day, the channel was ready, 20 meters long. Daniel laid a layer of coarse sand from the bank at the bottom. On top, a layer of crushed charcoal as thick as a palm. Then the moss. Then he planted the reeds, roots down, tightly packed. He spaced the 6 clumps evenly along the entire length. Then he carefully dug an entrance from the main channel at the start of the canal. The water began to flow. Slowly. Dark and oily at the entrance. It flowed to the end of the canal. He sat down. He waited. Water appeared an hour later. It was murky, but not oily. There was no reddish tint. He scooped up a handful. He sniffed it. The metallic smell remained, but had grown fainter. About 3 times. It wasn't clean water, but it was a result. The first result in 4 days. Daniel sat down on the bank and stared for a long time at the water flowing from his filter. Then he laughed, quietly, to himself. Alone in the dead forest. He knew this was only the beginning. The filter would take weeks to reach full capacity. The reeds needed to take root and build up their root mass. The charcoal needed to become saturated and start absorbing contaminants consistently. But the process was underway. Water flowed through the filter and came out cleaner than it went in. Physics. Biology. No magic. On the 5th day, He began to tackle the problem of food. He'd run out of bread yesterday. His stomach was growling. He searched the surrounding area within a kilometer's radius, looking for something edible. He found a little. Cattails were growing by the swamp. Their rhizomes are edible, tasteless and fibrous, but nutritious. He dug up a few, rinsed them in the swamp water, and roasted them over coals. The food was disgusting, but it was food. He also found mushrooms, not on trees, but in the soil, small and gray, similar to earthen oyster mushrooms, but differently shaped. He didn't dare eat them, not yet anyway. He had to test them first. He broke off a piece and rubbed it on his wrist. If his skin didn't turn red after a few hours, that meant the first test was passed. Then he could try a bit on his tongue. An old method. Slow but reliable when there's no lab. On the 6th day, he noticed a change. The water coming out of the filter was noticeably cleaner, almost clear. The smell had almost disappeared. And there was something else. The soil around the channel's outlet had changed color. Slightly. Barely noticeable. It was no longer black, but dark brown, the color normal, moist soil should be. He crouched down. He touched it, rubbed it between his fingers. The texture was changing. Slowly, but it was changing. The clean water was doing its job, washing away the toxins, letting the soil breathe. On the 7th day, he boiled some cattail rhizomes in water from the filter. It was the first time in 3 days he'd eaten something hot. He sat by the fire, chewed, thought about how he needed a vegetable garden, a small patch of cleared ground where he could plant something simple, something that would grow quickly. But for that, he needed seeds, and he had no seeds. He looked through his bag, tools, rope, twine, a flint, a mug, a knife, a hatchet. Nothing organic, nothing he could plant. So he'd have to look for it. Somewhere in this dead forest, there had to be pockets of life. The swamp was one of them. The reeds had survived, the moss had survived, the cattails had survived. So there must be others. On the morning of the 8th day, he set out to scout. He headed north, away from the stream, deep into the forest. He walked for 2 hours. The forest changed slowly. The trees grew sparser. The soil was drier. The smell was fainter. And then he saw something he hadn't expected. A clearing. A small one, about 40 meters across. And grass was growing there. Real grass. Short, stiff, gray-green, but alive. He got down on his knees. He touched it, ran his hand over it. The grass was real. He dug into it with his knife. The soil beneath the grass was different. Not black, dark brown, with tiny roots. With a scent. The scent of earth. Not metal, not rot. Earth. He sat there in that clearing and couldn't get up. For several minutes he just sat there, sniffing a handful of normal soil. Then he began to examine the grass more closely. He found 3 kinds. One looked like couch grass, the second like clover. He didn't recognize the third. All 3 were wild and tough, but they were alive and they produced seeds. Small, dry, autumn seeds. He gathered everything he found, a handful of seeds in a rag, like gold. On the 9th day he returned to the stream. The water from the filter was already almost clear. He filled a mug to the brim. He held it up to the light. A slight cloudiness, but no oily film, no reddish tint. He sniffed. The smell of water. Ordinary water. He took a sip. Waited. Took a second. The water was cool and clear, slightly sweet, like water from a forest spring. He drank the whole mug. And filled it up again. On the 10th day, he woke up to a sound, a quiet one, almost inaudible. He opened his eyes. He listened. The sound was coming from the stream. He got up. He walked toward the water. He sat down by the filter's outlet. and he saw it. A dragonfly. A small one, with transparent wings. It was perched on a reed stalk above the clear water, basking in a faint ray of sunlight that had broken through the clouds. It was the first flying insect he'd seen in this forest. It had flown down to the clear water. Daniel watched it, motionless. The dragonfly spread its wings, folded them back, took flight, circled over the water, and landed again. 100 meters away, on a high branch of a dead elm, Sirin Teal stopped breathing. She watched the dragonfly. She hadn't seen dragonflies in Mournwald for 30 years, not since the day the spring died and all living things had either left or perished. And now she sat alone on a reed by the stream that had been poisoned 10 days ago, and she sat above the water that a human had purified, without magic, without a blessing, without a priest or a ritual, just with her hands, with charcoal and reeds. Sirin squeezed the branch so hard that the bark cracked beneath her fingers. For 130 years, she had watched over the people in this forest. Not a single one of them had ever restored the water. Not a single one had brought the dragonflies back. In 10 days, Daniel had built a biofilter out of sand, charcoal, moss, and reeds, and purified a section of the stream. He found a lush clearing with wild grass seeds. On the 10th day, the first dragonfly in 30 years flew to the clear water, and Sirin realized that this man was accomplishing the impossible without magic. On the 11th day, Daniel began building a vegetable garden. He chose a spot near the filter's outlet, where the soil had already begun to change color. 10 days of clean water had done their work. The topsoil was still dark, but no longer black, dark brown. He marked out the garden bed, 1 meter by 3, a small one. There was no point in making it any bigger yet. He began to dig, removing a layer of soil as thick as his palm. This layer was the most contaminated. He carried it aside. The soil beneath it was slightly better. He dug it up, broke up the clumps, mixed it with ash from the fire. Ash is an alkali. It neutralizes acidity, and the soil here was acidic. He knew this by the smell and the color. Then he brought moss from a boulder. He chopped it up and mixed it into the soil. Moss retains moisture and creates an environment for beneficial bacteria. Then he gathered the fallen gray leaves from the trees. They were dead and dry, but still organic matter. He placed them in a shallow pit next to the garden bed. He poured filtered water over them. This would become compost. In a few weeks, the leaves would begin to decompose and produce a nutrient-rich substance that could be added to the garden bed. He sowed the seeds, the ones he'd collected in the clearing, couchgrass and clover. Not for food, for the soil. Clover fixes nitrogen in the soil through bacteria in its roots. Every agronomist knows that. Here, no one knew it. To the locals, clover was a weed. To Daniel, it was the first step toward living soil. He watered the garden bed with filtered water. He sat down nearby. He looked at his work. A small rectangle of tilled soil amid a dead forest. Absurd. Almost laughable. But that's exactly how any restoration begins. With one small plot. With 1 square meter. Over the next few days, he alternated between working in the garden, expanding the filter, and exploring. The filter was working steadily. The water coming out was clean. The reeds had taken root and begun to produce new shoots. That was a good sign. It meant the soil around the canal was also beginning to come back to life. On the 14th day, he set out to explore to the west. He walked 3 kilometers. The forest was denser here. The trees stood closer together, and they were taller. Some of them weren't quite dead. He stopped at one, a hornbeam. Old, sick, but not dead. Leaves still clung to the lower branches, curled, yellow, but leaves nonetheless. Daniel walked around the tree. He examined the trunk. The bark was cracking and peeling away. The root collar was wet, dark. He dug around the base. The roots were soft, rotten. Root rot, a classic case. Too much moisture and no drainage. Water pools around the roots and they suffocate. They rot. The tree is slowly dying. He could fix it. A simple drainage ditch from the tree down the slope to divert the water, let the roots dry out. Prune the dead branches so the tree wouldn't waste energy on what couldn't be saved. He worked all day. He dug a ditch about 10 meters long. He pruned 6 dead branches. He treated the cuts with ash to prevent infection. By evening, the tree looked the same. Of course it did. Trees don't recover in a day, but in a month or 2. If the drainage works and the roots start to breathe, the hornbeam will sprout new leaves, string and green. Daniel didn't know that this very tree stood on the border of the Silvara clan's territory. He didn't know that 3 people were watching him. Not just Seirin, 2 others as well. Young scouts. They saw how the man tended to the tree. He didn't chop it down for firewood. He didn't walk past it. He stopped. He examined it. And he tended to it all day long. And then he left. He left no mark. He didn't claim the territory. He didn't demand anything. He just left. The next day, one of the young scouts reported to the elders. Seirin stood nearby in silence. An elder named Olverin listened with a stony expression. When the scout finished, Olverin asked only one thing. "Did the man touch the spring?" "No," replied the scout. "He only touched the tree." Olverin was silent for a long time. Then he said they needed to continue watching. Nothing more. Seirin nodded, but there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Distrust. Not yet, but interest. On the 18th day, Daniel saw the first sprout. He came to the garden bed in the morning as usual. He watered it and froze. A tiny green stalk was poking out of the ground. Clover. It had sprouted. In soil that had been dead just a month ago. Daniel crouched down and stared at that sprout for a long time. A single stalk, 2 millimeters tall. Green. Alive. It was proof. Not for anyone else. For himself. The land here wasn't cursed. It was sick. And what is sick can be healed. On the 21st day, what he had both been waiting for and fearing at the same time happened. A person came to his camp. Not an elf. A person. A woman. She emerged from the forest to the south. Thin, dirty, in a tattered dress, with a sack on her back. She saw the campfire and stopped. She stood there and watched. Daniel stood up. They looked at each other. The woman was young, about 25 or so. Dark hair, cut short, a sharp face. Eyes on the alert, like those of a beast ready to flee. Daniel raised his hand, palm forward, slowly. He told her that had water, clean water, and food. Not much, but there was some. The woman didn't move. She looked at him, at his garden, at the stream with the filter, at the campfire, at the dead oak tree. Then she asked who he was. Her voice was hoarse, like that of someone who hadn't spoken to anyone in a long time. He replied that his name was Daniel, that he'd been exiled here, that he'd been living here for 3 weeks already. She asked what he was doing. He said he was healing the land. She looked at him as if he were crazy. Then she looked at the clover sprout, at the clear water flowing from the filter, and she sat down by the fire, not right next to it, 3 meters away, but she sat down. Her name was Elsa Kane. She didn't tell her story all at once, in bits and pieces, over the course of several days. She was an herbalist, from a village on the southern border of the kingdom. Her mother was also an herbalist, too good at it. The Church of the Green Light accused her of heresy. The village was burned to the ground. Her mother died. Elsa fled. Her younger sister was with her, 12 years old. A week later, her sister fell ill. A fever, an ordinary fever that could be cured with 3 herbs. But Elsa had no herbs. The church had confiscated all her books, all her supplies, everything. Her sister died in her arms on the side of the road. Elsa walked north for 2 months, not because she knew where she was going, because everything was burning in the south. She crossed the border into Mornevald because no one went there, because there she could die in peace. She hadn't planned to survive, but she did. On cattail roots and rainwater, 2 weeks, and then she saw the smoke from his campfire. Daniel listened. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he nodded. He stood up. He walked over to his garden plot. He returned 10 minutes later. He crouched down next to her, no closer than she would allow. He showed her 3 plants. "This," he said, "this is wild mint. It grows by the swamp. This is willow bark. The willow survived on the shore. This is cattail root, dried and ground. 3 ingredients. A decoction made from them reduces fever. It fights inflammation. It helps with fever, ordinary fever, the kind that kills you only when there's no medicine." He spoke calmly. Without pressure, he simply showed her the plants and explained what to do. Elsa looked at the 3 stems in his hands. Then she stood up, turned around, and walked into the forest, without saying a word. Daniel didn't follow her. He set the plants down by the fire and went back to work. She returned at dawn. Her eyes were red. Her face was wet, from dew or from tears. He didn't ask. She sat down by the fire. She picked up the 3 plants. She examined each one. She sniffed them. She rubbed them between her fingers. Then she looked at him and asked what else he knew. He replied that he knew enough, and that he needed help, because one person can't heal an entire forest. Elsa Kane didn't smile. She didn't shake his hand. She didn't swear allegiance. She said she would stay, as long as there was something left for her to learn. No longer. Daniel nodded. That was enough. Daniel laid out the first vegetable garden and dug a compost pit. He healed a sick hornbeam on the border of the elves' territory, which caught their attention. On the 18th day, the first clover sprouted. On the 21st day, Elsa Kane, a fugitive herbalist, came to him. He showed her the recipe for a decoction to treat the fever that had killed her sister. She stayed. With Elsa's arrival, the work went twice as fast. She knew the forest, not this particular forest, but forests in general. She knew which plants were edible and which were poisonous. She knew how to set snares for small game and how to find water. Daniel knew the soil. He knew how to heal the earth and the trees. Together, they complemented each other. The first week together, they expanded the vegetable garden. They doubled the size of the garden beds. Daniel showed Elsa the principle of composting. She looked at the pile of rotting leaves with the expression of someone being told that trash is gold. He said that in a month, this pile would turn into the best fertilizer she'd ever seen. She replied that she'd never in her life used fertilizer. In her village, they simply plowed the land while it was still fertile, and when it stopped yielding, they burned the grass and plowed it again. Daniel explained that this was exactly why the land in the kingdom was dying. The fields were being depleted within a single generation. Then they were abandoned, and people moved on, or went to war over others' lands. She was silent. She was thinking. Then she said that this explained a lot. Elsa turned out to be a quick learner, eager for knowledge. She remembered everything the first time. The names of herbs, the proportions of decoctions, the principles of filtration. She asked questions constantly. Why does ash reduce acidity? Why does reed purify water? Why does clover enrich the soil? Daniel explained, patiently, without condescension, just as he would explain to a colleague, and Elsa could sense it. To him, she wasn't a student. She was a partner. On the 28th day after they started, they caught their first rabbit. Or rather, Elsa caught it. She set the snares masterfully, small, skinny, but it was meat, their first meat in 2 weeks. They roasted it over a campfire and split it evenly. Daniel ate and thought about how they needed shelter, a real one. The hollow in the oak tree protected them from the wind, but it wouldn't protect them from the rain, let alone the winter. They began building a hut. Daniel chose a spot between the oak tree and the stream, a frame of poles, walls of interwoven branches smeared with clay. Elsa found the clay by the swamp. They covered the roof with layers of moss and bark. The work took 5 days. The hut was small, 3 by 4 meters, 1 room, a stone hearth in the center, a smoke hole in the roof. The floor was dirt, but it was a shelter. Walls, a roof, a home. The first home in the dead forest. Elsa said it was the worst house she'd ever seen. Then she added that it was the first house where she felt safe. She said it quietly, almost under her breath. Daniel pretended not to hear. On the 35th day, he went to check on the hornbeam, that very one, on the border of Elven territory, and he saw it. 3 new leaves, small, pale, but green. The drainage was working. The roots had begun to breathe. The tree was recovering. He stood there and looked at those 3 leaves as if they were a miracle. Though there was no miracle. There was a drainage ditch, pruning of dead branches, ash on the cut surfaces, agronomy, science, common sense. But 3 green leaves on a tree that had been dying for 30 years looked like a miracle. And that's how those who witnessed it perceived them. Seirin reported to Olvarin that very evening. The hornbeam had sprouted leaves. That very hornbeam they'd given up on 15 years ago. That very hornbeam where a man had dug all day long. Olvarin said nothing, but Seirin noticed his fingers twitch. On the 40th day, Daniel discovered that someone had been near his snares. Not a beast, a human. Or perhaps not a human. The tracks were strange, light, almost imperceptible. He wouldn't have seen them if he hadn't been looking intently. The snares were empty, but they had been moved. Just a little, a couple of centimeters, as if someone had been studying them. And there was more. Next to one of the snares lay a bundle of dried mushrooms. It was just lying there on a rock, as if someone had accidentally left it behind. He picked up the bundle. He sniffed it. The mushrooms smelled of earth and something nutty. He brought them to Elsa. She turned pale. She said they were forest mushrooms, the kind gathered by the forest folk. That's what the peasants called the elves. She had never seen them in person, but had heard stories. Daniel asked if they were poisonous. Elsa said that the stories claimed the opposite, that elven mushrooms were the purest food in the world. They ate the mushrooms. The mushrooms were incredible, meaty, with a rich, nutty flavor, filling. One bunch was enough to feed them both. Daniel sat by the fire and thought. The elves had slipped them some food. They'd made it look like a coincidence. So they were watching. That meant they'd seen the filter, seen the vegetable garden, seen the hornbeam with its new leaves, and decided that this man deserved at least a bundle of mushrooms. It wasn't a gift. It was a test. He understood that. The question was what to do next. He could try to make contact, leave something in response, or he could keep working and wait. He chose the latter. Because trust cannot be begged for. It can only be earned through time and deeds. On the 45th day, Elsa made a discovery. She found wild mint in such abundance that it would be enough for 100 decoctions. A whole strip of mint along the northern edge of the marsh, hidden behind the rocks. She brought back an armful. Her eyes were shining. She said that if she'd had this mint a year ago, her sister would still be alive. Then she fell silent. She stood there for a moment and began spreading out the mint to dry. Daniel silently helped her. They dried the mint all day. They hung it on ropes inside the hut. The scent filled the small space, fresh, clean, lively. The first pleasant scent in this forest. On the 50th day, Daniel decided to expand the purification zone. One filter wasn't enough. The stream was being purified over a short stretch, but upstream and downstream, the water remained poisoned. He built a second filter. Downstream, same principle. Sand, charcoal, moss, reed. There was more reed now. The first bushes he'd planted had grown, and he could take shoots from them. This time, Elsa helped. They dug together. The work went faster. They dug a 15-meter channel in 2 days. On the 55th day, a cat came to the hut. Wild, skinny, striped, with one torn ear. It sat by the entrance and watched them. Elsa froze. She said that cats don't live in a dead forest. Daniel said that this one apparently didn't know that. The cat stayed. It ate the mice that had begun to appear near the garden. Mice, another sign of life. Where there are plants, insects appear. Where there are insects, there are mice. Where there are mice, there are predators. The ecosystem was recovering, slowly, one link at a time. But it was recovering. By the end of the second month, the garden yielded its first sprouts. Not clover. It had been growing for a long time and had gained strength. Wild cattail that Daniel had transplanted from the marsh. It took root in the garden bed and began to grow. Its rhizomes were edible, coarse food, but reliable. And there was something else. Among the clover sprouts, Daniel noticed a plant he hadn't planted, small, with round leaves. He didn't know what it was. It didn't resemble anything from his earthly experience, but it was alive and growing quickly. He decided not to touch it, to see what would grow. Elsa suggested a name for their place. Not a camp, not a stopover, a home. She said this place needed a name. Daniel asked why. She replied that a place without a name doesn't exist. He smiled. He suggested calling it Green Hollow. A green hollow. Elsa said there were at most 2 square meters of greenery here. Daniel replied that for now, yes. She looked at him, at the vegetable garden, at the stream with clear water, at the 3 green leaves on the hornbeam visible from their clearing, and she nodded. Green Hollow. Daniel and Elsa worked together to expand the vegetable garden and build a hut. The hornbeam on the border of the elven territory sprouted 3 new leaves. The elves secretly slipped them a bundle of dried mushrooms. The ecosystem around the filter began to come to life. They named their settlement Green Hollow. On the 60th day, Daniel decided it was time to go back to the hornbeam, not to heal, to check on it, and to show that he wasn't coming for personal gain. He went alone. Elsa stayed at the hut. She was busy preparing supplies, drying herbs, brewing decoctions, stockpiling provisions. Winter was approaching. They both sensed it. The nights were getting colder. The air was drier. The hornbeam looked better. Not healthy. It was years away from being healthy, but better. There were now 9 new leaves, not 3 like last time. 9. The bark at the base had begun to dry out. The rot was receding. The drainage ditch was working. Water was flowing through it down the slope, and the roots were breathing. Daniel walked around the tree. He examined every branch. He found 2 more dead shoots. He pruned them off. He treated the cuts with ash he'd brought with him in a rag. He added some fresh charcoal to the drainage ditch. He rearranged the stones along the edges. He worked calmly and methodically. He finished by noon. He sat down next to the tree. He took out a piece of flatbread from the rush bag. He ate and looked out at the forest. The forest here was different. Not dead. Dying. There's a difference. A dead forest is bones and ashes. A dying forest is still fighting, still clinging on. And if you help it, it might pull through. He finished the flatbread. He stood up, and he saw her. She was standing 20 meters away, between two tree trunks, motionless, as if she were part of the forest. If he hadn't looked in that exact direction at that exact moment, he wouldn't have noticed her. Not very tall, slender, wearing clothes the color of bark and moss. Her hair was long, dark, with a coppery sheen. Her ears. He saw her ears, elongated, pointed at the tips. She was looking at him. Her eyes were like amber in the light, golden with green sparks, still, unblinking. Daniel didn't move. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't speak. He just stood there and looked back at her. 1 second, 2, 5. She didn't leave. So she wanted to be seen. It was a decision, not a mistake. She had come out to him on purpose. Daniel nodded slowly, once, and pointed to the hornbeam, then to the new leaves, and back at her, as if he was saying, "Here's the tree. Here are the leaves. I did this for him, not for you. But you can look." She looked at the leaves for a long time. Then she shifted her gaze to the drainage ditch, to the charcoal, to the ash on the cut surfaces. She saw everything, every detail. Then she did something he didn't expect. She took a step back, raised her hand. Something small was clasped between her fingers. She placed it on the root of the nearest tree, turned and walked away, silently, like a shadow. Daniel waited a minute. He walked over. A small bag made of thin fabric lay on the root, about the size of a fist. He untied it. Seeds. Not the kind he knew, different ones, large, light-colored, with a faint scent of honey. He'd never seen seeds like these before. But he knew they were alive, and that they'd been given as a response, not as a gift, as a response to his work. He tucked the little bag into his shirt. He walked home, without looking back, because he felt that she was still watching, and that there was no need to turn around. Saren Teal was watching his back from a height of 30 meters. She had given him the seeds of the silver hornbeam, the sacred tree, the one that grows only in elven groves. She had done this without permission from the Veda, without the elder's knowledge. It was a violation, a serious one. But she had seen how he healed the hornbeam, saw how he sat nearby and ate bread made from cattail, saw how he pointed at the leaves, not at her, at the leaves. He wasn't trying to impress her. He was simply working and showing results. In 134 years, he was the first person to speak to the forest in the language of the forest. When Daniel returned to Green Hollow and showed Elsa the seeds, she didn't recognize them. But she said they were beautiful and that they smelled like spring. He planted 3 seeds in the best part of the garden, the one where the soil had been receiving clean water and compost for a month, where clover had worked nitrogen into the soil, where earthworms had begun to appear. Yes, earthworms. On the 40th day, he saw the first earthworm in the garden bed. That was the moment he realized everything was working out. Because earthworms don't live in dead soil. Earthworms are proof of life. He watered the seeds, covered them with a layer of moss to keep them warm, and waited. The next 10 days were devoted to preparing for winter. He and Elsa worked from dawn until dark. They gathered cattail rhizomes. They dried them. They ground them into flour between stones, coarse, gray flour. But they could bake flatbreads with it. They gathered wild garlic that Elsa had found in a crevice near a boulder. There wasn't much of it, but it was precious. They dried mint, lots of mint. It was good both as medicine and as tea. They gathered mushrooms, those gray ones that Daniel had found during the first week. He'd checked them. They turned out to be edible. Not tasty, but safe. They dried them in bundles. They chopped firewood, lots of firewood. Winter in these latitudes would be long. Daniel could tell by the angle of the sun and the length of the days. They insulated the hut. They packed the cracks with moss and clay. They made a door out of bound poles, rough but sturdy. They built a second wall of stones around the hearth so the stones would store heat. On the 70th day, the silver hornbeam seeds sprouted. All 3 of them. The sprouts were unusual, not green, silvery white, as if moonbeams had hatched from the earth. They grew quickly, noticeably faster than any other plant in the garden. Within a week, they had grown to the length of a palm. The leaves were thin and delicately veined, with a silvery sheen. Daniel touched them every morning, gently, with his fingertips. They were warm, like living skin. He didn't know what that meant, but he knew these trees were special. In his world, trees weren't warm. These were. And there was more. The ground around them was changing faster than anywhere else. Within a week of sprouting, the soil within a half-meter radius of each sprout had grown darker, softer, more alive, as if the trees were infusing something into it, not taking, but giving. He didn't understand the mechanism, but he saw the result. On the 75th day, the first snow fell, wet, heavy. It settled on the dead branches and the gray earth and turned the forest into a black and white photograph. Daniel stood by the cabin and watched the snow. 3 months. He had lived in the dead forest for 3 months. He cleared a section of the stream. He grew a vegetable garden. He built a house. He found an ally. He received seeds from creatures that hate humans. And he planted 3 trees that glow silver. Not bad for a man who was sent here to die. Elsa came out of the cabin. She looked at the snow. She said winter would be harsh. Daniel agreed. He said their supplies would last 2 months if they were careful, but winter here lasts 4 months. Elsa looked at him. She asked what they were going to do. He said they'd figure something out, because there was no other choice. She snorted. She said it was the worst plan she'd ever heard. Then she went inside to put water on for some mint tea. Daniel stayed standing there. He looked at the snow, at the 3 silvery sprouts in the garden, already dusted with white, at the smoke rising from the hut, at the cat's tracks in the first snow. Somewhere far to the west, toward the elven lands, a shadow flitted among the tree trunks. He wasn't sure he'd seen it, but it seemed to him that the shadow had nodded. For the first time, Siren had appeared openly to Daniel and given him the seeds of the silver hornbeam without the council's approval. The seeds sprouted into unusual silvery shoots that accelerated the regeneration of the soil around them. Daniel and Elsa were preparing for winter, but their supplies were insufficient. The first snow fell. Winter came like a blow. Not gradually, not gently. It struck with frost on the very first night after the snow and never let up. The temperature dropped every day. The stream was covered with a crust of ice along its edges. The filter was still working. Water flowed through the channel beneath a thin layer of ice, but more slowly, much more slowly. Every morning, Daniel broke the ice at the filter's inlet. His hands went numb within a minute. He made himself a pair of mittens from scraps of fabric stuffed with dry moss. Rough, ugly, but warm. Elsa sewed something resembling a vest out of rabbit skins. There were 4 skins. Not enough, but at least it was between their bodies and the wind. The first week of winter they ate well. Flatbreads made from cattail flour, dried mushrooms, mint tea, wild garlic. There was enough. By the second week, the portions grew smaller. By the third, they ate twice a day, morning and evening. During the day, only tea. Daniel was losing weight. He could feel it. He had to tighten his belt tighter and tighter. His ribs were starting to show. Elsa's cheekbones had become sharper. Her eyes looked bigger. She didn't complain, not once. She just silently sliced the portions thinner and silently brewed the tea weaker. The cat caught mice and brought them to the doorstep. Sometimes they took his catch. The mice were tiny. There was just enough meat in them for a single sip of broth. But broth means calories, and calories are life. On the 30th day of winter, Daniel woke up to a sound he hadn't heard in 3 months. A knock. Someone was tapping on the wall of the hut. He went outside. A sack was standing by the entrance, a large one, made of gray cloth and tied with a thin cord. No one was there, only footprints in the snow, light ones, almost invisible, leading westward. He untied the sack. Inside were mushrooms, dried ones, lots of them, several handfuls. Also a bundle of dried meat, dark, tough. He couldn't tell what kind of animal it was. And at the very bottom, a small bundle wrapped in leaves. He unwrapped it. Inside lay a handful of berries. Red, small, unfamiliar. They smelled sweet and sour. Elsa recognized the meat. She said it was venison, prepared the way the forest people do it, smoked and rubbed with some kind of herbs. She said that a single strip of this meat could feed an adult for a whole day. Daniel did the math. Meat, mushrooms, berries. Enough for 3 weeks if they rationed it. Together with their own supplies, this gave them a chance to make it through the rest of the winter. He stood in the doorway of the hut with a sack in his hands and thought. The elves were feeding them. Not openly, not as allies, like someone who tosses food to a stray dog, but they were feeding them, which meant he wasn't their enemy. Not yet, anyway. He carried the bag inside. He and Elsa laid everything out. They counted it. They divided it into daily portions. Elsa asked why they were doing this, why they were feeding him. He replied that he didn't know. Maybe because he was healing their tree. Maybe because the dragonfly had returned to the clear water. Maybe because he hadn't cut down the forest. Or maybe simply because he hadn't tried to leave. Elsa said all 3 reasons were silly. Then she added that that was probably exactly why they were true. Winter dragged on. The days were short. It got dark early. It got light late. They spent most of the day in the cabin, by the hearth. Daniel drew, with a stick on the packed earthen floor. He drew plans, diagrams, maps of the future vegetable garden, future filters, the future garden. Elsa watched. Sometimes she asked questions. Sometimes she nodded silently. He told her about crop rotation, about how you can't plant the same thing in the same spot 2 years in a row, about how different plants help each other. Legumes provide nitrogen. Alliums repel pests. Root vegetables loosen the soil. She listened. She took it all in. Once she said that in her village, the elders used to say that the earth gets tired, that it needs to rest. But no one knew how to let it rest except by leaving the field fallow for a year, and weeds would grow in the fallow field, and the weeds were burned, and the whole cycle started over. Daniel explained that weeds aren't enemies, that many of them heal the soil. Clover, which they consider a weed, actually enriches the soil with nitrogen. Dandelions, with their long roots, draw minerals from deep underground to the surface. Nettles indicate that the soil is rich. Elsa was silent for a long time after that. Then she said that her whole life had been a war against the very thing that could have saved her. Daniel didn't know what to say. In the middle of winter, he checked on the silver sprouts. They hadn't died. It was surprising. The snow around them was melting. Within a 20-centimeter radius of each sprout, there was no snow. The ground was warm. Not hot, just warm, as if the trees were warming the soil from within. The sprouts didn't grow in winter. They froze, but they didn't wither. Their silvery leaves stood open, dusty with frost, but alive. Daniel touched the ground around them. It was soft, not frozen. Worms were wriggling in it. In the middle of winter, in a dead forest, worms in the warm earth around a silver tree. He sat down in the snow and stared for a long time. There was something about these trees that he didn't understand and couldn't explain through science. They weren't just growing. They were doing something to the earth, something greater than any tree on earth. He didn't know the word for it. Magic came closest, but he refused to use that word because magic implies the unknowable, and he believed that everything could be understood. You just had to observe long enough. The last month of winter was the hardest. Food was running out. They'd stretched the elven sack as far as they could, but the portions had become very small. 1 flatbread and a handful of mushrooms for the 2 of them a day. Endless tea. Mint tea, until he felt sick. The cat had grown as thin as a string. The mice had gone into hiding. The snares lay empty. Daniel caught himself thinking about food constantly. He'd wake up and think about food. He'd fall asleep and think about food. He worked and thought about food. The hunger wasn't sharp like pain. It was dull, aching, constant, like background noise you can't turn off. One night, Elsa said quietly that she was afraid, not of death, but that all their efforts had been in vain, that the garden would freeze to death, that the filter would break, that everything he'd taught her had been pointless. Daniel replied that the garden wouldn't freeze to death, because the clover overwinters in its roots, because the silver trees warm the ground, because the worms are alive. He said that spring would come, and everything they'd planted in the fall would start to grow. They just had to wait. She fell silent. Then she said he was the most stubborn person she'd ever met. He replied that it was a professional trait. Gardeners are more stubborn than rocks. The last week of winter, there was no food left. None at all. Daniel drank hot water with mint and tried not to think about how his hands were trembling from weakness. Elsa was lying by the fire. She got up only to toss some firewood on the fire. The cat lay next to her and didn't move either. And then a second sack appeared on the threshold. In the morning, without a trace, as if the wind had brought it. Mushrooms, meat, and something else. 2 large pieces of honeycomb, golden, warm, heavy with sweetness. Elsa saw the honey and began to cry, for the first time in front of him, quietly, without a sound. Tears streamed down her dirty cheeks, and she didn't wipe them away. Daniel broke off a piece of the comb. He gave her half. They ate the honey with their hands, sitting on the floor of the hut in the dead forest at the edge of the world. The honey was sweet, thick, with a hint of some flowers he didn't recognize. It was the best honey he'd ever tasted in both of his lives. 3 days later, it began to warm up. The snow settled. It darkened. Water began to drip from the hut's roof. The stream roared louder. The ice cracked and melted away. Winter was ending. They had survived. Winter had nearly starved Daniel and Elsa to death. The elves had twice tossed down sacks of food, which saved their lives. The silver sprouts warmed the earth around them, even in winter, and the worms did not freeze to death. Daniel taught Elsa the principles of crop rotation and the role of weeds. Winter ended, and they survived. Spring hit Mornwald like an explosion. Slow, silent, but an explosion nonetheless. The snow melted in 10 days. The earth was laid bare, wet, black. But not uniformly black everywhere. Around the filters and the garden, the soil was different. Dark brown, smelling of life. Clover shot up from its roots in the very first week of warmth. Green, thick, vibrant. Daniel stood over the garden bed and couldn't take his eyes off it. In the fall, he had planted it over 2 square meters. Now the clover covered 5. It had spread over the winter, under the snow, in the warm soil around the silvery trees. The trees themselves had shot up as if they'd been waiting for a signal. During the first week of spring, every sprout had grown 1/2 meter. The trunks were slender, supple. The silvery bark shimmered in the sun. The leaves unfurled, wide and lacy. And around them, a ring of living earth expanded with each passing day. By the end of the second week of spring, there was a circle of normal, healthy soil 2 meters in diameter around each tree. Grass was sprouting within these circles. Not the kind Daniel had sown. Wild, native. It had lain dormant in the dead soil for 30 years and had been awakened by the warmth of the roots. Daniel knelt and examined the sprouts of wild grass. His hands were shaking, not from weakness, from the realization of the magnitude of what he was seeing. These silver trees weren't just growing. They were healing the earth, actively, purposefully. Their roots were doing something to the soil, purifying it, warming it, awakening it. What he had been doing with filters and compost over months, the trees were doing in days. He didn't understand how, but he understood what, and for now, that was enough. In the third week of spring, people arrived. Not elves, people. 3 of them. A man appeared first. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with blacksmith's hands and a scar across his forehead. He was coming from the south, alone, unarmed, wearing a tattered quilted jacket. He said his name was Bran, that he was a deserter. He'd fled Count von Mornau's army after their unit burned down a village on the eastern border. He said that he no longer wanted to burn villages, that he'd heard from vagabonds that a man lived in Mornwald who grew grass on dead soil. He decided to check it out. Bran turned out to be a blacksmith, a real one, with 20 years of experience. He could make anything: knives, nails, hinges, horseshoes. He needed an anvil and a bellows. Daniel showed him the stones by the stream. He said they'd have to make the anvil themselves. Bran looked at the stones, then at Daniel, then at the vegetable garden, then at the silver trees, and he sat down to build the forge. 2 days after Bran arrived, a boy came along, about 12 years old, skinny as a rake, quiet. He didn't say his name, didn't say where he was from. He just stood at the edge of the clearing and watched. Elsa brought him a flatbread. He ate it so quickly that she didn't have time to step back. She brought a second one. He ate it. A third. He ate it. Then he sat down where he was standing and fell asleep. They carried him to the hearth. They covered him up. He slept for 2 days. When he woke up, he said one word: Tom. A name. He didn't say anything else. Daniel didn't press him. He put him to work watering the garden. Tom watered silently and carefully, as if he were doing the most important thing in the world. A week later, the sisters arrived. 2 young women, about 20 and 17 years old, Rena and Maeve, from a village on the southern road. Their house had burned down when the Baron's troops passed through the village, seizing provisions. They'd been walking north for 2 months, because there was nowhere else to go. Rena was a seamstress. Maeve knew how to cook. Both were afraid of everything, every sound, every shadow. The first week, they flinched at the sound of an axe. Elsa took them under her wing, quietly, without explanation, just by being there, just showing them what to do, just not asking questions. Green Hollow became a settlement of 6 people, and a cat. Bran built a horn in a week, primitive, made of stones and clay, but it worked. The first thing he did was forge a shovel, a real one, from a piece of iron he found in the stream bed. The iron was rusty and brittle, but Bran reforged it. He annealed it. He hammered it out. He sharpened it. The shovel turned out rough but sturdy. Daniel held it in his hands and almost burst into tears. For 3 months, he'd been digging with a knife and a stick. For 3 months, he'd broken his fingernails and scraped the skin off his palms. And now he had a shovel. A real shovel. He could dig. Dig properly, like a human, not like a beast. With the shovel, the work went 10 times faster. In the first week, he tripled the size of the garden. He dug new beds. He set up a compost pile. He planted the seeds he'd been collecting all fall. Cocksfoot, clover, cattail, mint, wild garlic. And those other unfamiliar plants that had appeared on their own and that he had carefully propagated by dividing their roots. On the 5th day of spring, he noticed that larvae had appeared in the cleared area of the stream. Tiny, transparent, aquatic insects. They scurried along the bottom among the rocks. The water was clean enough for them. A week later, fry appeared. Tiny, silvery, resembling minnows. He didn't know where they'd come from. Maybe from the swamp. Maybe from some tributary he hadn't found. But they were there, alive, swimming in water that had been poisoned just 4 months ago. He called Tom over, showed him the fry. Tom crouched down. He looked at them for a long time. Then, for the first time in all that time, he smiled. A faint smile, barely noticeable, but he smiled. Daniel decided that for that one smile alone, it had been worth enduring the winter. On the 10th day of spring, he went to the hornbeam. The tree had come to life, truly come to life. There were no longer just 9 leaves. There were too many to count. The lower branches were covered in fresh greenery. The bark had become thicker, darker, healthier. The rot at the base had disappeared. The root collar was dry and sturdy. The drainage ditch was working. Daniel walked around the tree. He stroked the trunk. The bark was warm from the sun, alive. He looked up. A bird was perched in the hornbeam's crown. Small, gray. It was singing. The first bird he'd heard in Mournwald. He stood there and listened. A minute. 2. The bird sang and he listened, and the forest was silent all around. But this silence was different. Not dead. Waiting. As if the forest were listening along with him and remembering that it too had once been able to make sounds. On the way back, he found another little bag of seeds on the trail. Not from the silver hornbeam, different ones, small, various shapes, 10 kinds, maybe more. He didn't recognize a single one, but he knew they'd been left for him. The elves were no longer hiding. They were having a conversation, a silent one, through gifts and observation, through seeds and honey. Daniel accepted the rules. He didn't seek them out. He didn't call out to them. He left nothing in response. He simply kept working. And they continued to watch. He planted new seeds, each species separately. He labeled the beds with sticks bearing notches. First, second, third, 10th. He would observe, take notes, watch what grew and how. Rena and Maeve had settled in. Rena began sewing, from rabbit skins, from coarse fabric that Bran had traded for with one of the vagabonds passing through Mournwald on their way south. Maeve took charge of the kitchen. She cooked with whatever was available. Cattail flatbreads, a stew of mushrooms and garlic, a mint infusion. Simple food, but hot and regular. For the first time in 5 months, Daniel ate 3 times a day. He could feel his body recovering. His muscles were filling out. His mind was clearing. His hands had stopped trembling. Tom had become his shadow. He followed him everywhere, silently, watching what he did, repeating it. Daniel taught him, just as he had taught Elsa, without condescension, as an equal. He showed him how to test the soil, how to determine acidity, how to read the plants. Tom soaked it all in, faster than Daniel had expected. The boy had a natural gift with his hands, precise, patient. the hands of a future gardener. In the spring, 4 new people arrived at Green Hollow. Bran, the blacksmith, forged a shovel for Daniel. Tom, the boy, and the sisters Rena and Maeve appeared. The silver trees grew rapidly and healed the soil around them. Frying appeared in the cleansed stream, and the first birds sang in the hornbeam. The elves continued to planting seeds. The meeting with Saren took place on the 93rd day, not by the hornbeam, by the stream. Daniel was cleaning the second filter. He was replacing the layer of charcoal that had become clogged over the winter. He was working alone. Elsa was in the hut. Bran was forging nails for the second house. Tom was watering the garden. Daniel straightened up, and there she was, standing 5 meters away. Just standing there. Not hiding, not watching from afar. Standing and looking at him. He recognized her. The same eyes, amber with green sparks. The same bark-colored clothes. The same gaze, unmoving, appraising. She was beautiful. Not the way people are beautiful. Different. The way a 200-year-old tree is beautiful. She spoke first. Her voice was low, steady. She spoke in a language that Daniel understood. Not perfectly, but he understood. The common trade language of Waldheim. With an accent. With unusual pauses between words, as if she were choosing each word separately. She said her name was Saren, that she had been watching him for 100 days, that she had seen everything. The filter, the vegetable garden, the hornbeam, the silver trees, the dragonfly, the fry, a bird. She said the Council of Elders wanted to know who he was. Daniel stuck his shovel into the ground, wiped his hands on his pants, said he was a gardener. Saren's expression didn't change. She asked what a gardener was. He said it was a person who heals the earth and plants. She asked what kind of magic he used. He said none, that he uses knowledge, an understanding of how the soil works, water, roots, light. She was silent for a long time. Then she asked where he got the silver hornbeam seeds. He replied that a woman from the forest had given them to him. Dark hair with a coppery sheen, amber eyes. Saren didn't move a muscle, but Daniel noticed her fingers twitch on the bowstring behind her back. She knew it was her, and she knew that he knew. They stood facing each other, a man in a dirty shirt holding a shovel, an elven scout, 134 years old. Between them lay 5 meters and 30 years of mistrust. Daniel asked if the bird on the hornbeam was alive. The question was pointless. Strange. But Saren answered. Yes, the bird had built a nest. Daniel nodded. He said he was glad. Saren turned and left, without saying goodbye, without a sound. But Daniel knew she would return, because she hadn't come for answers. She had come to see if she could ask questions, and he had let her leave with an answer. She returned 3 days later, back to the stream. Again, she stood 5 meters away. Daniel was working. He was expanding the third filter. He didn't stop. He didn't turn around. He just kept digging. She watched for half an hour. Then she asked a question. She asked why he wasn't touching the big spring. He stopped. He looked at her. He asked which spring. Saren pointed north. She said that deep in the forest there was a place from which power once flowed, a power that nourished the entire forest, the entire land, and all the water. 30 years ago, that power died, or was killed. Ever since then, the forest has been sick. Daniel sat down on the bank and stretched out his legs. He said he wouldn't touch the great source because he didn't know what it was. He didn't know how it worked. He didn't know what had poisoned it. And meddling with something you don't understand is the best way to make things worse. She looked at him. He continued. He said that right now he was working with small things, a stream, the soil, individual trees. He was learning how the earth works in this world. Because it doesn't work the same way as in his world. It's similar, but not quite the same. The silver trees are proof of that. When he understands enough, he'll go to the source. But not before. Saren asked how long he'd need. He replied that he didn't know. Maybe a year, maybe 2. She said they didn't have 2 years, that the clan's ancestral tree was dying, that without it, the clan would lose the memory of its ancestors and its connection to the forest. She said this in an even voice, without emotion, like a report. But Daniel heard fear behind that voice, an old, deep, long-held fear, the fear of a being afraid of losing everything. He stood up. He said he wanted to see that tree. She shook her head. She said it was impossible, that the council would not allow a human into the grove. He nodded. He said he understood. But if the tree was dying, he needed to see it. Because he couldn't heal what he hadn't seen. She left, again without saying goodbye. The next 2 months were a time of work, hard work, monotonous, daily. The garden was expanding, new beds, new crops. Of the 10 types of elven seeds, 8 sprouted. 2 of them turned out to be herbs with a strong medicinal scent. Elsa identified one based on descriptions from her mother's confiscated books. Silver brass root, an herb that reduces inflammation and heals wounds twice as fast as usual. In the kingdom, it was worth its weight in gold. Here, it grew in a bed next to clover and cattail. Bran built a second house, for the sisters, then a third, for himself and Tom. Then a workshop, a small one, with a forge and an anvil and a couple of tools he'd forged himself from scrap iron he'd found. He forged a second knife, scissors, 3 hoes, 2 sickles. Each new tool changed life in the village. With the scissors, Rena began to cut fabric properly. With the sickles, they were able to harvest grass. With the hoes, the vegetable garden grew faster. Daniel watched and thought. He saw how 6 people could transform a place. How hands and minds and perseverance turned dead earth into living soil. Slowly, 1 meter a day, but they transformed it. By midsummer, the silver trees had grown to their full height, 3 meters, trunks as thick as an arm. Their canopies spread wide. Beneath them, it was shady and cool. The ground around them, within a 5-meter radius, was alive, completely. Grass, flowers, beetles, worms, even a small lizard. The first reptile in Mornwald in 30 years. Daniel began to understand. The silver trees aren't just trees. They're nodes, restoration points. Their roots penetrate deep into the soil and do something to it on a level he couldn't see. They purify, they nourish, they awaken. If only he could plant 10 such trees, 20, 50, the forest would recover many times faster. But he had only 3, and no one was bringing any new seeds. For the first time, Saren spoke openly with Daniel and told him about the Great Spring and the clan's dying ancestral tree. Daniel refused to rush to the spring until he understood how the earth worked in this world. Green Hollow was expanding. The silver trees had grown and become powerful hubs for soil restoration. From the elven seeds, a silver-rooted medicinal herb of the highest value had sprouted. By the end of summer, 11 more people had arrived at Green Hollow. Not all at once. 2 at a time, 3 at a time. Fugitives. Hungry. Frightened. Rumors were spreading. Up north, beyond the dead forest, there's a man who grows herbs from ashes. He has food. He has a roof over his head. It's safe there. Whether it was true or not, no one knew. But when you're being chased, or when your village has been burned down, or when you've been sold into slavery for debts, you'll cling to any rumor. Daniel took everyone in. No questions asked, no strings attached. There's one rule, he told everyone. No one eats here unless they work. Not because I'm greedy, because there's not enough food, and every pair of hands is needed to make more of it." They nodded. Everyone nodded. Because it was fair, and they understood that. Among the newcomers were two elderly people, a husband and wife. They were over 60, thin, emaciated. They'd been driven out of their village because they could no longer work in the fields. The village headman said he had no use for mouths without hands. They were heading north to die. Daniel put the old man to work repairing tools. His hands trembled, but his eye was steady. He put the old woman to work sorting and drying herbs. She knew the plants. Not like Elsa, but she did. Within a week, the old man had repaired every broken handle in the settlement. The old woman had sorted the herb supplies by type and tied them into neat bundles. Mouths with hands. Daniel looked at them and thought that a world in which old people are cast out simply for growing old deserves to be remade. By the end of summer, 17 people lived in Green Hollow. 5 houses, a workshop, a vegetable garden covering 100 square meters, 3 filters on the stream, 3 silver trees, a pharmacy. Elsa had set up the pharmacy. It was small, just a single shelf made of rough planks. On the shelf stood clay pots filled with decoctions and ointments, silver root, mint infusion, an ointment made of resin and garlic for wounds, a decoction for fever, that very one, made from 3 herbs. The first patient arrived the day after the pharmacy opened. One of the newcomers, a man in his 40s, a former carpenter. The wound on his leg had become infected. He'd been limping for a month. Elsa cleaned the wound. She applied the ointment. She bandaged it with strips of clean cloth. 3 days later, the pus was gone. A week later, the man was walking without a limp. He looked at his leg as if it were a miracle. Elsa told him that the miracle was the ointment made from resin and garlic, and that if he ever walked through the mud with an open wound, she would personally tie him to the bed. The man nodded quickly and left without looking back. Daniel watched and smirked. Elsa had found herself. Not a herbalist, not a fugitive, a healer. A tough one, straightforward, one who wouldn't tolerate nonsense, but a healer. One who heals because she knows how, and because she can't help but heal. On the 120th day, Saren came again, not alone. With her was a young elf, tall, fair-haired, with a long bow on his back. He looked at Green Hollow with wide eyes, at the houses, at the garden, at the people, at the silver trees. Saren approached Daniel. She said the council had made a decision, that he was invited to the Elven Grove. Just him, unarmed. Daniel asked why. She replied that he knew why himself. The family tree. He nodded. He said he would go tomorrow morning. In the morning, he left with Saren. They walked west for 3 hours. The forest changed, gradually. The trees grew taller, their trunks grew thicker. Here and there leaves hung from the branches, dry, sparse, but leaves nonetheless. Then moss appeared, on the rocks, on the trunks, green, real. The air changed. It grew thicker, more humid, with the scent of pine needles and something sweet. They came upon the grove suddenly. There was no boundary, no wall. It was simply that at some point the dead forest ended and the living one began. Not healthy, sick, but alive. The trees stood enormous, ancient. Some were 1,000 years old. Daniel could tell by the trunks, by the rings on the broken branches, by the roots that plunged into the ground like walls. Between the trees stood structures, not houses, something halfway between houses and trees. Walls made of living wood, roofs of intertwined branches, windows in the trunks, stairs made of roots. The elves were watching him, many elves, from the trees, from the windows, from the ground, silently, motionless, the way a forest looks at a stranger. Saren led him to the center of the grove. There it stood, the ancestral tree. Daniel stopped. The tree was enormous, 5 times larger than any tree he had ever seen in his life. The trunk was 20 meters in circumference. The crown stretched up into the sky. But the crown was sick. Half the branches were bare. The bark was cracked. Something dark oozed from the cracks. The leaves that remained were yellow, withered. A woman stood at its base, tall, upright, dressed in silver fabric. Her hair was white, long, reaching to her waist. Her face was young, but her eyes were old, deep, like wells you look into and never see the bottom. Princess Liara Silvara. She didn't say hello. She didn't introduce herself. She pointed at the tree and said one word. "Look." Daniel walked up to the trunk. He placed his palms on the bark. He closed his eyes. The bark was cold, not warm like that of the silver trees, cold and damp. He opened his eyes. He walked around the tree, slowly, 3 times. He examined every meter of bark, every crack, every root. He crouched down at the base. He dug into the soil with his knife. He sniffed it. He rubbed it between his fingers. He looked at it. He stood up. He looked up at the crown. At the dead branches, at the living ones, at the transition between them. He crouched down again. He checked the drainage. Water was pooling. The soil around the roots was wet. Too wet. Stagnant. He stood up straight. Liara was watching him. The council of elders stood behind her. 7 figures in gray robes, silent, motionless, Olvaran among them. Daniel said the tree had root rot, that water was pooling at the roots and not draining away, that the roots were suffocating, that this is why the bark is cracking and the crown is dying. He said it needs drainage, deep drainage. And one more thing. He needs to test the soil at depth, because he senses something in it. The same smell as in the dead forest, but fainter, as if the poisoning had reached here too, slowly, over 30 years. But it had reached here. Liara was silent. Then she asked if it could be cured. Daniel looked her in the eyes. He said the tree had root rot and was lacking a certain trace element, that it could be cured. It would take a long time, but it could be cured. Liara didn't move. But Daniel saw something crack behind her face, behind that mask of coldness and calculation. Something she'd been holding inside for a very long time. She heard words she hadn't heard in 10 years. It can be cured. Olvaran stepped forward. He asked what he wanted in return. Daniel said nothing. But he needed to come here, regularly, to monitor the tree, to treat it properly. And he needed help. People to dig the drainage ditches, because the tree is enormous, and he can't handle it alone. Olvaran looked at Liara. Liara looked at the tree, then at Daniel. She said he would get help, and that from this day forward he was allowed to enter the grove. Saren stood to the side, silently. But Daniel noticed that she had relaxed her shoulders slightly, for the first time since he'd known her. Green Hollow had grown to 17 people. Elsa opened a pharmacy. Daniel was invited to the Elven Grove, where he first saw the Silvara clan's ancestral tree and Princess Liara. He diagnosed root rot and said the tree could be cured. Liara granted him regular access to the grove. Work on the family tree took up the rest of the summer and the beginning of fall. Daniel came every 3 days. It took him 3 hours to get there. He worked until dark. He spent the night in the grove on a bed of moss that was laid out for him without a word. It took him 3 hours to walk back. Every time, without fail. On the first day, he began the drainage work. He dug a trench from the tree's roots down the slope. The elves gave him 4 assistants. Young, strong, silent. They dug beside him and looked at him the way you look at a doctor who's operating on someone in your family, with horror and hope at the same time. The drainage ditch was deep, 1.5 meters. Daniel couldn't take any chances. If the water didn't drain away from the roots, the tree would continue to rot. A week later, the ditch was ready. 60 meters long. The water started flowing. Slowly, but it flowed. Dark, with that same smell, metal and sulfur. He stood over the ditch and sniffed the water. The poison had reached this far, just as he'd thought. For 30 years it had crept through the underground layers from the dead large spring to the living grove. For 30 years it had been slowly killing the tree. Not quickly, not all at once. Drop by drop, year by year, leaf by leaf. He told Liara about it. She stood next to him by the ditch. She looked at the dark water. She asked if the poison could be stopped. He said it could. Filters, the same ones as on the stream, but bigger. And between the great spring and the grove, to intercept the flow before it reaches the roots. But to do that, you need to know exactly where the water comes from. You need a map of the underground streams. Liara said the clan had old maps, very old ones, from before the poisoning. She'd let him see them. He nodded. The maps were beautiful. Drawn on the thin bark of a silver hornbeam, fine lines, precise markings. Daniel didn't understand Elvish script, but Siren translated for him. She would come when he was working with the maps. She'd sit down next to him. She'd point things out. Here's a stream. Here's an underground stream. Here are the former springs, small ones. There were 7 of them. 4 are dead. 3 are still alive, but barely, and 1 big one. In the center, dead, poisoned. The one from which black water radiated in all directions, like from a broken heart. Daniel studied the maps every evening. He drew his own, on birch bark, rough, but accurate. He was beginning to understand the structure. The Mournwald forest had once been a single system. The large spring fed the small ones. The small ones nourished the soil nourished the trees nourished the air nourished the rain nourished the spring. A circle, closed, perfect. And someone had broken it, killed the central node, and the whole circle had collapsed. Over 30 years, slowly, painfully, like a body dying when the heart stops. Not immediately, but inevitably. He asked Siren what had happened to the spring. She fell silent, for a long time. Then she said that people had killed it. He asked how. She said they had come with ritual blades. The royal mage, by order of the king. The current king's grandfather. They plunged the blades into the spring's heart, and it screamed. The whole forest heard the scream. All the elves, all the beasts, all the birds. And then silence. A deathly silence that has lingered here ever since. Daniel listened. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he asked where the blades were. Siren said they were in the spring, that no one had retrieved them, that no one dared go down there. He remembered. Between visits to the grove, life in Green Hollow went on as usual. Bran forged, Elsa healed, Tom watered and weeded, Rena sewed, Maeve cooked. The newcomers built, dug, and learned. Daniel left Elsa in charge during his absences. She managed, firmly, efficiently, without unnecessary words. Every morning she would tell those who woke up later than the others that it was good morning and that the great mage of the north had ordered them to weed the garden beds before lunch. No one argued. In early fall, an event occurred that changed everything. Daniel was working by the ancestral tree. He was clearing away the roots and removing the dead bark that was preventing the tree from breathing. He worked carefully, slowly, like a surgeon. He examined every piece of bark before removing it. He left the healthy bark untouched. He removed the diseased parts. He treated the cuts with a mixture of ash and resin. He had been working for 3 hours when he heard footsteps. Not elven ones. Elves make no sound when they walk. These footsteps were heavy, slow, those of an old man. He turned around. An old elf was walking toward the tree, a very old one. His hair was white. His face was like the bark of an old oak tree, scarred by time. His eyes were cloudy, tired. It was Olverin. But not the Olverin Daniel had seen at the council. That one had been stony, rigid. This one was broken. He was carrying a child in his arms, a little girl, an elf. She looked about 5 years old, maybe 6. She wasn't moving. Her eyes were closed. Her skin was gray. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. Fever. Daniel could see the fever from 10 paces away. Liara followed behind Olverin, silently, her face as white as chalk. Olverin approached Daniel. He stopped. He looked at him. Daniel looked at the girl. He asked what was wrong with her. Liara answered for the old man. Illness. Fever. Not the usual kind. The one that comes from poisoned water. Children sometimes get it. Elven magic doesn't help. The family tree is too weak to heal her. It used to heal everyone. Now it can't. Daniel placed his hand on the girl's forehead. Hot. Very hot. Her pulse was fast and weak. He examined her skin. A sallow. Her lips were dry, dark circles under her eyes. He knew what it was. He'd seen it on Earth. Heavy metal poisoning plus an infection. Her body was fighting 2 enemies at once and losing to both. He looked at Olverin. He said he needed to take the girl to Green Hollow, to the pharmacy. Olverin didn't move. Liara stepped forward. She told him, "Let him try." Olverin silently placed the child in Daniel's arms. The girl was light, almost weightless, like a bird. He carried her. It was a 3-hour walk to Green Hollow. Saren walked beside him, silently, with her bow at the ready. Not against him, for him. They arrived by evening. Elsa saw the child and didn't ask a single question. She cleared the table, brought water, lit a fire. Daniel laid the girl on the table. He examined her. Pulse, breathing, temperature, skin, eyes, tongue. Then he went to the apothecary. He took silver root, mint, willow bark. He ground them up, mixed them, poured hot water over them. He strained it, let it cool until it was warm. A decoction for fever, enhanced with silver root, 3 ingredients instead of 1. He lifted the girl's head. He dripped the decoction into her mouth, 1 drop at a time. She swallowed, reflexively, while unconscious. Then he made a compress, a cloth soaked in cold, filtered water, on her forehead, on her wrists, on her ankles. He changed them every hour. The first night. The fever didn't subside. Daniel sat beside her. He changed the compresses. He gave her the decoction every 2 hours. Elsa took turns sleeping with him. 2 hours he, 2 hours she. Saren stood by the door outside. She didn't leave. All night. The second night. The fever barely subsided, by half a degree, maybe a full degree. Her breathing became more even. Daniel changed the composition of the herbal tea. He removed the willow bark. He added honey. That very same elven honey. The last piece of comb honey he'd been saving. The girl drank it. The third night. Daniel didn't sleep. Not at all. His eyes burned. His hands trembled. But he changed the compresses. He gave her the decoction. He monitored her pulse. He counted her breaths. By dawn, her fever began to subside, quickly, like a wave receding from the shore. Her skin turned pink. Her breathing became deep, calm. The fourth morning, the girl opened her eyes. Big, golden, just like Saren's. She looked at Daniel, at his eyes, red from lack of sleep, at his dirty hands, at his face, and she said one word, "Eat." Daniel laughed, hoarsely, through tears he hadn't expected. Elsa brought the broth, warm, made of mushrooms and herbs. The girl ate slowly, in small sips. Saren entered the hut for the first time. She saw the girl. She saw that she was eating. And she leaned against the wall and closed her eyes, and stood there for a minute without moving. Olverin arrived around noon. He'd walked for 3 hours from the grove, alone, unescorted. He entered the hut. He saw his granddaughter. She was sitting on the table, drinking the broth. Small, pale, but alive. Olverin stood in the doorway. He watched. Then he took the amulet from around his neck. It was small, made of dark wood, with a symbol carved into it that Daniel couldn't read. He placed it on the table in front of him without saying a word. He turned to Lyre, who was standing behind him, and said 3 words to her. Daniel didn't understand them. They were in Elvish, but Saren translated them later. The House of Healing. From that day on, the Silvara clan officially named Green Hollow the House of Healing, and no elf would ever raise a weapon against it again. Daniel healed the family tree and learned from Siren that the Great Spring had been poisoned with ritual blades on the orders of the current king's grandfather. Elder Olverin brought his sick granddaughter, and Daniel spent 3 sleepless nights nursing her back to health with a decoction of silver root. The girl recovered. Olverin handed over the ancestral amulet, and the clan named Green Hollow the House of Healing. After Olverin named Green Hollow the House of Healing, everything changed. Not immediately, not overnight, but irreversibly. The elves began to arrive. First, one at a time, then in pairs, then in groups. They brought sick children, elderly people with aching joints, warriors with wounds that hadn't healed for years. Elsa healed them. The silver root accomplished things that elven magic could not because the magic was weak, but because magic treated the symptom, not the cause. An elven healer relieved the pain. Elsa removed the source of the pain. The difference was like that between someone who paints over rusty iron and someone who removes the rust. Daniel continued working on the family tree. The drainage system was working. Water was flowing away from the roots, but poison continued to seep up from the depths, slowly, constantly, like poison in an unhealed wound. He needed a filter, a big one, between the source and the grove. He discussed this with Liara. She listened. She asked questions, precise ones, smart ones. She was a politician, but no fool. She understood the scale of the problem. She asked how many people were needed. He said 20, for 2 weeks. She gave him 30. 15 elves and 15 people from Green Hollow. They worked together. For the first time in 30 years, elves and humans, side by side, digging the same ditch, hauling the same stones, mixing the same clay. At first in silence, warily. The humans eyed the sharp ears. The elves eyed the rough hands. Then Bran dropped a stone on his foot and cursed so loudly that birds took flight from the trees within 100 meters. The young elf next to him flinched. Then he snorted. Then he laughed. The first laughter shared between humans and elves in 30 years began with a stone on the blacksmith's foot. The filter turned out to be enormous. 120 meters long, 3 meters wide, 2 meters deep. Layers of sand, coal, moss, and reeds. There were plenty of reeds now. They had spread along the cleared stream and were producing shoots that could be transplanted. Water passed through the filter on the 3rd day after it was started. Black at the inlet, brown at the outlet. A week later, it was brown at the inlet, clear at the outlet. Not clean, but incomparably better. Daniel stood at the filter's outlet and felt the ground beneath his feet begin to change. He didn't see it, he felt it. Through the soles of his boots, the earth was becoming softer, more alive, warmer. Liara stood beside him. She felt it too. She was bound to this earth by all her blood, by all the memories of her lineage. She said quietly that for the first time in 30 years, she felt the earth breathing. Daniel nodded. He said this was only the beginning, that the filter would slow the poisoning, but it wouldn't stop it. To do that, they'd have to get to the source itself. She looked at him. She asked when. He said not now, that first they needed to secure what they had, grow more silver trees, set up more filters, give the land time. She didn't argue. She was patient. 200 years had taught her to wait. Fall brought the harvest, Green Hollow's first real harvest. The garden yielded cattail, garlic, mint, silverroot, and 4 more kinds of elven herbs that no human had ever grown before. Elsa gathered the herbs and wept, not out of grief, but because she now had her arms full of medicines she knew how to use, medicines that no one could ever take away from her. Daniel looked at the harvest and thought, silverroot was as valuable as gold in the kingdom. They had sacks of it. If they could find a way to send it south, they could trade, buy things they couldn't make themselves: cloth, iron, salt, tools, seeds of common crops, wheat, barley. He discussed this with Liara. She thought about it for 3 days. Then she said that the clan had old trade routes, abandoned but passable, and there were middlemen, half-breeds living on the border between the forest and human lands. They could smuggle the goods out unnoticed. The first caravan left in mid-fall. It was small: 2 sacks of silverroot, 3 sacks of medicinal herbs. The middleman was an old half-elf named Kale. He looked at the silverroot. He sniffed it. He tasted it on his tongue, and said that in the southern cities, 1 sack of this would fetch enough silver to buy a village. The caravan returned a month later, with cloth, with salt, with a sack of wheat flour, with 3 sets of steel tools, with news. Kale said that people were starting to talk about the herbs from the north, just in whispers for now, just among apothecaries and physicians. But people were talking. They were asking where it came from, who grew it, how to buy more. Daniel heard this and felt a chill in his chest, not from joy, from realization. The rumors will reach the capital, the palace. Prince Albrecht, the very same one who sent him here to die. And then a completely different story will begin. By the end of fall, Green Hollow had a population of 43, 8 houses, a workshop, a pharmacy, a warehouse, a 300-square-meter vegetable garden, a school. Elsa had opened the school, not for children, but for adults. She taught them to identify herbs, make decoctions, and treat wounds. Tom became her assistant. The quiet boy who used to water the vegetable garden now knew 20 types of medicinal herbs and could prepare a fever remedy with his eyes closed. He was 13. He didn't talk about his past, but he smiled every day. When he watered the garden beds, when he carried water, when he sat next to Daniel and listened as he explained why worms were more important than swords. Elves and humans worked together for the first time on a large filter between the spring and the grove. The first trade caravan carrying silverroot headed south and returned with supplies and troubling news about growing rumors. Green Hollow had grown to 43 people, with an apothecary, a school, and a workshop. The winter of the second year was easier. Not easy, easier. There were more supplies, more houses, more people. The elves sent honey and dried meat before the first snow, not in secret, openly, as trading partners. In return, they received silverroot and ointment for wounds, a fair exchange. Daniel used the winter to plan. He drew maps, diagrams, expansion plans. He thought about how to restore the 3 small springs along the forest's perimeter. He already understood the principle. The silver trees healed the earth. Filters purified the water. Compost revitalized the soil. 3 tools. Simple, slow, but effective. If all 3 were applied to a small spring at the same time, the spring would begin to revive within a season. In theory. In practice, he didn't know. He hadn't tried it. In the spring, he gave it a try. He chose the first of the 3 living small springs, the weakest one, the one that was barely trickling at the eastern edge of the forest. He examined it. The water was murky, but not black. The soil around it was gray, but not dead. The smell was faint. The spring wasn't dead. It was dying, slowly. It had been dying for 30 years. Daniel installed a filter. He planted reeds. He planted a silver hornbeam sapling nearby, the 2nd generation, grown from seeds from his 3 trees. They were already bearing fruit. In a year and a half, they had grown into full-fledged trees and produced seeds, which he planted, which sprouted. He lined the spring with compost. He dug a drainage ditch. He cleared the stream bed. And he waited. After a month, the silver hornbeam sapling by the spring had grown a meter. After 2 months, it was 2 meters tall. The water became clearer. The soil around it darkened. It came to life. By the 3rd month, clear water was flowing from the spring. Not just clear, different. It glowed, barely noticeable, a greenish sheen. Like those veins in the soil he'd seen on the first day. Daniel scooped up a handful. The water was warm, soft, with a hint of honey and iron. Not that sickly iron from the poisoned stream. Living iron, the kind that makes up blood. He understood. Root springs aren't just springs. They're the forest's circulatory system. They carry more than just water. They carry life. Magical life. Real life. The kind that makes grass grow twice as fast, wounds heal 3 times as fast, and trees live for 1,000 years. He had restored one. 2 small ones remained, and 1 large one, the one he didn't dare approach yet. By midsummer of the 2nd year, Muriel Vane arrived, 19 years old, slender, dark-haired, with eyes that burned like lanterns and a tongue that moved faster than thought. She didn't come alone. She brought her younger brother, 10 years old, quiet and frightened. She was searching for the north, looking for a place where real medicine was made. Her father had been an apothecary in the capital, the best in the city. He had been executed 6 months earlier for refusing to poison a baron whom Prince Albrecht found disagreeable. Muriel fled on the night of the execution. She walked for 4 months. She saw Elsa's pharmacy and froze on the threshold. She stood there, looking at the shelves, the little pots, the bundles of herbs, and the silver root. Then she turned to Daniel and asked if she could stay. He said she could, if she was willing to work. She said she was the daughter of the capital's finest apothecary, that she knew how to make 30 kinds of medicines, that she could read in 3 languages, that she knew anatomy, botany, and mineralogy. He said that was excellent, and that tomorrow morning she would start by weeding the garden beds. Muriel opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Then she laughed. She said it was the first time she'd met someone who responded to 30 kinds of medicines by weeding. He replied that medicines grow in the earth, and that until she understood the earth, she wouldn't understand medicines. She weeded for a week, silently, furiously. Then she began asking questions, lots of questions. Daniel answered every one. A month later, he put her in charge of the school attached to the pharmacy. Not Elsa, Muriel. Because Muriel knew how to explain things. She had the gift of a teacher. Words flowed from her like water from a purified spring, clear, precise, and vivid. Elsa wasn't offended. She hated teaching. She loved healing. Two different things. A week after Muriel arrived, Hannah Reyes came. 24 years old, a cartographer, formerly in the royal service, wanted for refusing to draw the border of a disputed county incorrectly. Calm, precise, taciturn, wearing glasses made of cut crystal. She looked at Daniel's maps, his crude drawings on birch bark, and said they were an insult to cartography. Then she sat down and began redrawing them. In 3 days, she produced the first accurate map of Green Hollow and the surrounding area. Every house, every garden bed, every filter, every trail, every spring, every silver tree. Daniel looked at the map and, for the first time, saw his work in its entirety. Not in pieces, not day by day, in its entirety. And it was vast, much vaster than he'd thought. He asked Hannah to make a map of Mournwald, the whole thing, with the elven trails, with the springs, with the healing zones, with the boundaries between the dead and living lands. She asked why. He said it would be the first honest map of this forest, not for war, not for conquest, for understanding. To know what kind of soil is where the springs are, where to heal what. Hannah looked at him for a long time. Then she took off her glasses, wiped them, put them back on, and said that this would be the best map she would ever draw in her life. The second caravan set off southward in early fall, larger than the first. 5 sacks of silver root, 10 sacks of medicinal herbs, 2 sacks of dried mushrooms from the elven forests. The caravan returned 6 weeks later, with supplies, with tools, and with news that Daniel had feared. The prince knows about the herbs from the north. His men are questioning the merchants. They're searching for the source. Kale said to expect guests by spring. Daniel restored the first small root source and realized that these sources are the forest's circulatory system. Muriel Vane, the daughter of the executed apothecary, and the cartographer Hannah Reyes arrived. Muriel took charge of the school. Hannah began work on the first accurate map of Mournwald. The second caravan returned with a warning that Prince Albrecht had learned of the herbs and was searching for their source. The visitors arrived in the spring of the second year. Not an army, just one man, a royal inspector, not young, lean, wearing a clean doublet with the crown seal on his chest. His name was Harold Brem. He arrived on horseback, alone, without an escort. That was smart. A lone official raises no alarm. He doesn't provoke anyone. He simply came to take a look. Daniel met him at the edge of the village, politely, calmly. He invited him in, showed him the huts, the vegetable garden, the apothecary, the school, the workshop, the filters on the stream. He didn't show him the silver trees. He didn't show him the elven grove. He didn't mention the springs. He showed him a modest homestead, an exile who hadn't died and had planted a little garden. Nothing dangerous, nothing worth paying attention to. Harold Brem walked around Green Hollow and looked around. He sniffed the earth. He tasted the water. He examined the garden beds. He was no fool. Far from it. He saw that the soil had been tilled in a way that was unlike anywhere else in the kingdom. He saw that the water in the stream was clean, even though all of Mournwald was famous for its stagnant water. He saw that the people were healthy and well-fed, even though they lived in the middle of a cursed forest. He spent 3 days in Green Hollow. He ate with them. He slept in the guest house. He talked to the people. With Elsa, who showed him the apothecary and explained how she makes ointment for wounds. With Bran, who showed him the smithy. With Muriel, who explained the principle of crop rotation to him and watched his eyes widen. On the 3rd day, Harold Brem sat down across from Daniel by the campfire. He asked him point blank, how did he do it? How did he grow a garden in a dead forest? What kind of magic? Daniel replied that there was none, that he uses knowledge, that soil is a living organism, that water can be purified with charcoal and reeds, that the soil can be healed with compost and crop rotation, that trees get sick for specific reasons, and those reasons can be eliminated. Brem listened. Then he said that this was impossible, that the church teaches that the earth is fertile only where it is blessed by the green light, and that barren land is a punishment for sins. Daniel replied that the church was. Brem looked at him for a long time. Then he stood up, mounted his horse, rode away. Daniel knew that Brem's report would decide everything. If he wrote that Green Hollow was a harmless trifle, life would go on. If he wrote the truth, those who feared the truth would come. Brem wrote the truth. Daniel found out about it 2 months later, when a detachment of 50 horsemen appeared on Mornewald's southern border under Prince Albrecht's banner. The detachment was led by Captain Grace O'Donnell, 31 years old, red-haired, tall, loud, a former mercenary, now the commander of a detachment hired by the prince to defend the kingdom's interests in the north. She rode into Green Hollow on horseback, wearing chainmail, with a sword at her belt, with 5 horsemen behind her. The rest were camped 3 kilometers to the south. She dismounted. She looked around. She saw the vegetable garden, houses, people, children, silver trees that by this point were already 5 meters tall and glistening in the sun, a pharmacy that smelled of mint and honey, a cat on the roof. She looked at all of this and said aloud that the prince hadn't mentioned that normal people lived here. Daniel came out to meet her, unarmed, in a work shirt, with dirt on his hands. He said he was glad to have guests and that lunch would be ready in an hour. Grace spent a week in Green Hollow. She ate with them. She went to the vegetable garden with Daniel. She watched him work. She listened as Muriel taught the peasant children to identify herbs. She saw Elsa set the shoulder of one of her own soldiers who had fallen from his horse. She saw an elven hunter bring venison to the Green Hollow market and trade it for a wound ointment. Elves, trading with humans, out in the open. She couldn't believe it. On the 5th day, she asked Daniel to show her the silver trees up close. He did. She touched the trunk. It was warm. She pulled her hand away. Then she pressed her palm against it again. She stood there for a minute. Then she said quietly that she had never felt anything like it, that the tree was like a living heart. On the 7th day, she gathered her soldiers. She went out to Daniel. She said she had orders from the prince to assess the situation and, if necessary, bring the settlement under the crown's control. She said she had assessed it, and that the situation was such that she was staying. She disbanded the 50 horsemen. Those who wanted to left for the south. 22 people stayed with her. Daniel asked why she was staying. She said she was tired of destroying things, that she wanted to try building. He said he didn't need a squad to attack, that he needed people who would make sure he could dig in peace. She smiled. She said she could do that. Green Hollow had gained a militia. 22 former mercenaries under the command of a woman who had decided that guarding the garden was more important than burning villages. Liara heard about the soldiers and came in person. Her first time in Green Hollow. Her first time on human territory in decades. She looked at Grace. Grace looked at her. 2 women. One in chainmail, the other in silver. Both were used to giving orders. Both were used to being obeyed. Liara asked why the soldiers were there. Daniel explained. Liara thought for a moment. Then she said that the Silvara clan was declaring Green Hollow a zone under its protection, that anyone who attacked the settlement would be attacking the clan. For the first time in 200 years, the elves had intervened in human politics. Grace whistled. She looked at Daniel. She said he was an interesting man. He replied that he was a gardener. She laughed, loudly, loud enough for all of Green Hollow to hear. It was the first genuine laugh from a mercenary in many years. Royal Inspector Brem visited Green Hollow and reported the truth. Prince Albrecht sent a detachment of 50 horsemen under the command of Grace O'Donnell. Grace saw the settlement and decided to stay. Liara declared Green Hollow an area under elven protection, the first time in 200 years that the elves had intervened in human affairs. The summer of the second year turned into a race against time. Daniel knew that once Grace failed to return, the prince would send someone more formidable. Time was running out. He restored the second small spring in 6 weeks. The same method: a filter, reed, silver hornbeam, compost, drainage. The spring came back to life faster than the first. The earth remembered. It had been waiting. It wanted to live. The third small spring yielded within a month. 3 of the 7 small springs were working again. Clean water flowed through underground channels. The trees along the channels began to come back to life. Not all of them, not right away, but the process was underway. The zone of living forest around Green Hollow expanded with each passing week. Green Hollow became a small town. 300 people. People kept coming and coming from all corners of the kingdom. Peasants from the Deadlands, unemployed artisans, herbalists whom the church had declared heretics, soldiers who were tired of fighting. They had all heard the same thing. Up north, there was a place where the land was alive and where everyone was welcome. Daniel couldn't stop them. He didn't want to. Every pair of hands was needed. But every new mouth had to be fed. The balance was fragile. Hannah had finished the map of Morningwald, complete. Every stream, every hill, every spring, every elven trail marked with Liara's permission, every recovery zone, every square meter of living and dead land. Daniel hung the map in his house and sat in front of it every evening. He looked at it. He thought. He saw small green spots spreading across the gray, like islands in a dead sea. But in the center of the map was an empty space, a large spring, dead, poisoned, a heart that no longer beats. Without it, the forest would never fully recover. The small springs healed the edges. The center remained dead. That fall, Daniel made a decision. He would go to the Great Spring. Alone. Saren said no. Liara said no. Elsa said no. Grace said he was crazy. He went anyway, with Saren, who refused to let him go alone. They walked for a day, northward, into the very heart of the dead zone, to where even the gray trees ended and only black, barren earth remained. No moss, no grass, no bugs, nothing. The earth was hot, dry, with a sweet, rotten smell. Daniel could feel it pulsing beneath his feet. Not the way living earth pulses, like a sick heart, irregularly, convulsively, in fits and starts. They found a well by evening, an old one, made of stone, wide, 5 meters in diameter. The stones were covered with a black film. Heat rose from the depths. And the smell. That very same one, metal and sulfur and death. Daniel lay down on the edge. He peered down. Darkness. Deep. Seemingly bottomless, but not empty. Somewhere at the bottom, something was glowing. Dimly. Greenish. Like a dying ember. He climbed down. Down the old stone steps hewn into the well's wall. Saren followed him down, silently, with a bow on her back and a knife in her hand. The steps were slippery, covered in black slime. The heat intensified with every meter. The air grew thicker, heavier. It was hard to breathe. He counted 120 steps before reaching the bottom. The bottom was stone, wide, like a hall, 20 meters across. And in the center, he saw it. The spring. Not a spring, not a stream. A fissure in the rock from which power had once flowed. Pure, green, alive. Now black slime oozed from it, slowly, thickly, like blood from a wound that hasn't healed in 30 years. And blades jutted out of the fissure, 3 of them, driven into the rock, hilt deep. The blades inside. On the pommel of each blade was a coat of arms. Daniel bent down. He looked closely. A lion and an oak tree. The coat of arms of House Waldheim, the royal coat of arms. He stared at the blades. 3 rusty blades driven into the heart of the earth 30 years ago. That's what killed the spring. Not a curse, not a natural disaster. 3 pieces of metal bearing the royal coat of arms. A ritual murder. Planned, paid for, commissioned. Siren stood behind him. She saw the blades. She knew they were here. But this was the first time she'd actually seen them. She was silent, but Daniel could hear her breathing. Ragged, heavy. Like a person who had carried the truth for 30 years and finally saw it confirmed. He didn't touch the blades. Not yet, anyway. He sat down on a rock next to the fissure, and he sensed it. Not with his hands, not with his nose, with something else. Something that had awakened within him over the course of 1.5 years of living on this earth. He sensed the source. Alive, not dead, dying. For 30 years it had held on, with 3 blades in its heart. For 30 years it had been oozing out its last drops of strength. For 30 years it had been waiting. Daniel placed his palm on the rock next to the fissure. The rock was hot. It was pulsing. And in that pulse, he sensed something. Not a voice, an image. Like a picture that flashes before your eyes as you fall asleep. He saw a dying old man, lying in the darkness, with knives in his chest, who had been waiting 30 years for a doctor, and that doctor had finally arrived. Daniel withdrew his hand. He stood up. He looked at Siren. He said he'd be back, with tools, with people, with a plan. But they had to get the blades. And after that, the source would need the same things any wounded person needs: clean water, time, and someone to stay by his side while the wound healed. They went upstairs. The night was cold and moonless. They sat by the well in silence. Then Siren pulled something small from her bosom. A locket, on a thin chain, old, worn, with a name engraved in Elvish. She said that Daniel had found it at the bottom of the small spring when he was restoring it a month ago, that he'd returned it to her without asking whose it was. It was her brother's locket, who had died 30 years ago, here, when the spring was destroyed. She was the only one from the reconnaissance squad who survived, and for 30 years she lived with the guilt of not having sensed the people in time. Daniel listened. She spoke quietly, without tears, as if giving a report, but her hands were clenching the locket so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. He didn't say anything. He just sat beside her, in the darkness, by the well, on barren ground, and he remained silent. Because sometimes, silence is the only thing you can offer. Fall of the 3rd year. The morning was cold and clear, the first clear morning after a week of rain. Daniel stood in the doorway of his house and looked out over Green Hollow. 300 people, 20 houses, a pharmacy, a school, a blacksmith shop, a bakery, a weaving workshop. 3 silver trees 10 meters tall and 12 more young ones scattered throughout the village. The vegetable garden had turned into an orchard. The orchard had turned into a field. The field stretched all the way to the stream and beyond. Grass grew where, 3 years ago, there had been nothing but black dust. The trees were sprouting leaves. Birds were singing. Fish were swimming in the stream. Real fish, not fry, full-grown, silvery. Daniel took a deep breath. The air smelled of earth. Not metal, not sulfur. Earth. Wet autumn earth after the rain. The best smell in the world. A month ago, he had returned to the Great Spring. With 20 men and 10 elves. They descended into the well. He pulled out the blades, one by one, carefully. The way you pull knives out of, carefully, so as not to make things worse. Each blade was heavy, covered with a black crust. Coats of arms shone through the rust, a lion and an oak. Waldheim. When he pulled out the last blade, the spring trembled. The entire ground around the well shook. Water gushed from the fissure. Not black, not murky. Green, glowing, warm. It filled the bottom of the well in a matter of minutes. They barely had time to climb out. The water rose up the steps behind them, as if it were in a hurry. As if it had been locked away for 30 years and had finally broken free. When they reached the top, the water spilled over the edge of the well. It flowed across the ground, across the black dead earth. And wherever it flowed, the earth changed before their eyes. The blackness faded. The soil grew lighter. It turned tawny, then brown, then dark brown with a reddish tinge. Within an hour, the earth within a 100-meter radius around the well came to life. Grass sprouted out of nowhere, from seeds that had lain dormant for 30 years, from roots that had dried up but not died, from the very memory of the soil itself. Cyrene knelt in that grass and wept, openly. Without hiding. She pressed her brother's medallion to her chest and wept. The young elves around her wept too. They remembered this forest when it was alive, and they saw it returning. That was a month ago. Now Daniel stood in the doorway, looking south, because they were coming from the south. An army. The royal banner. A golden lion and an oak tree on a blue field. 300 soldiers. Led by Count Edgar von Murnau, the king's cousin, the very one, who 30 years ago, as a young officer, had entered this forest with ritual blades. Riding beside him was the royal herald bearing a decree. The decree was simple. King Conrad declared that the revived northern lands had always belonged to the crown, that Lord Ashford had merely administered them by the king's highest grace. That grace had run out. That the lands were returning to the crown, along with everything built upon them, everything that had been grown, everything that had been created. Grace had positioned her people at the southern border, 22 former mercenaries against 300 soldiers. No chance. But they stood their ground, because behind them lay home, the first home they had chosen for themselves. Cyrene emerged from the forest. Silently. Shadows followed her, dozens of them. Archers of the Silvara clan. They stood among the trees, invisible, silent. But the Count could sense them. He had been here 30 years ago. He knew what the forest sees. The people of Green Hollow came out of their homes, all 300 of them. Old people, women, children, men. They stood behind Grace's militia, unarmed, with shovels and hoes, with children in their arms. They weren't going to fight. They were going to stand their ground. Daniel stepped forward, alone, unarmed, wearing a simple work shirt. In his hands he carried 2 things, a wooden box filled with soil and a canvas bundle. He approached Count von Murnau. The Count was sitting on his horse, looking down from above. Old, gray-haired, with a face as hard as stone. His eyes were sickly yellow. He was ill. Daniel could see it. His liver, or his kidneys, or both. Daniel set the box down in front of the Count's horse. He opened it. Inside was soil. Gray. Dead. Smelling of metal. He said it was soil from the Count's province, that he'd picked it up along the way, that it was dead, just as all of Mornwald had been dead 3 years ago. The Count stared at the soil. He didn't move. Daniel bent down, scooped up a handful from beneath his own feet. Black, rich, smelling of rain and mushrooms and life. He placed it next to the box. He said that the difference between these 2 handfuls was 30 years of work, that if the Count took this forest away from those who had tended it, in 30 years he would once again have the first handful, that he wasn't threatening, that he was simply explaining how the earth works. The Count looked at the 2 handfuls for a long time. Then Daniel unwrapped the canvas bundle. 3 blades, rusty, bearing the Waldheim coat of arms. He laid them on the ground before the Count. He spoke evenly and calmly. This forest wasn't poisoned by spirits. You poisoned it, personally. 30 years ago, on the orders of the current king's grandfather. You drove these blades into the heart of the spring and killed every living thing for tens of kilometers around. You killed the trees. You killed the water. You killed the earth. You killed the elves who lived here. And now that this forest is alive again, you want to take it away from those who healed it. Silence. Absolute silence. 300 soldiers were silent. 22 mercenaries were silent. 300 residents of Green Hollow were silent. The elven archers in the forest were silent. There was no wind. The birds did not sing. The world stood still. The Count looked at the blades, at the coat of arms, at the rust. His hands trembled. He recognized them. Of course he did. He himself had held one of them 30 years ago. Daniel continued. He said that among the witnesses present here was the entire council of elders of the Silvara clan, that people from the Church of the Green Light were standing there, 2 monks who had come to Green Hollow a year ago and stayed, that merchants from the southern guilds who buy medicines were standing there, that they all saw the blades bearing the royal coat of arms, and that they all heard his words. He said he was asking for nothing. He does not demand. He does not threaten. He offers. Morwald will become an autonomous region, not a feudal domain, not crown land, not a lordship. An autonomous region, where the land belongs to those who tend it, not to those whose coat of arms is on it, where elves and humans live as equals, where the church does not burn herbalists, where soldiers guard gardens instead of burning villages, where the elderly aren't told they're mouths without hands, where children learn to identify herbs instead of wielding swords. In return, Green Hollow continues to trade with the kingdom, silverroot, medicinal herbs, and pure water, knowledge of how to heal the land. Everything that grows on this land will be available to all, but it cannot be taken away, because without those who heal it, it will die again. And everyone knows this. Count von Mornau was silent for a long time. Then he slowly dismounted from his horse. His old legs could barely support him. He walked over to the box. He bent down. He took a handful of dead soil from his province. He sniffed it. Then he took a handful of living soil from Green Hollow. He sniffed it. He stood there, bent over, with 2 handfuls in his hands. Old, sick, tired. He looked back, to the south, back to where he'd come from, to his own land, half devastated, with barren fields, with starving villages, with soil that had ceased to bear fruit. He straightened up. He looked at Daniel. The Count's eyes were wet. He ordered the army to halt. Not to retreat, to stop. Then he said he wanted to talk. Not to fight, to talk. Daniel nodded. He said that the apple trees behind the pharmacy provided shade, that he had planted them 3 years ago, and this fall they had borne fruit for the first time, that he was inviting the Count to sit under those apple trees and talk about the land, about how it works, about how to heal it, about how even the Count's province could be brought back to life, if one wanted to, if one stopped burning and started healing. The Count looked at the apple trees, at the red fruit on the branches, at the grass beneath the trees, at the bees buzzing around. Bees. In Mournwald, where 3 years ago there hadn't been a single living creature. He walked toward the apple trees, slowly, wearily, like a man who had been carrying something heavy for 30 years and had just decided to try putting it down. Daniel walked beside him. They sat down under an apple tree. The Count picked an apple from a lower branch. He turned it over in his hands, took a bite. Juice ran down his chin. He chewed slowly, his eyes closed. Then he opened them and asked Daniel if it was really possible to heal his land. Daniel replied that it was. It would take a long time, but it was possible. It could be healed. Under the apple trees of Green Hollow, in a forest that had been dead 3 years ago, a conversation began. Not about war, not about power, not about coats of arms and borders, about the land, about how it is sick, about how it is recovering, about how it needs coal and reeds and clover and time, a lot of time, and people who are willing to give that time. Liara stood a little way off. She watched. Siren was beside her. Behind them stood the Council of Elders, Elsa, Muriel, Hannah, Grace, Bran, Tom, Rena, and Maeve. 300 people whom Daniel hadn't saved through heroic deeds, whom he'd saved through quiet, daily work, with a shovel, compost, clean water, seeds, and patience. Each of them stood there because, once upon a time, someone had done something small and concrete for them. Not saved the world, healed a wound. Shown them how to make a decoction, repaired a handle, drawn a map, taught them to identify herbs, fed them, gave them shelter, didn't turn them away. And now they stood there, all together. Behind them, apple trees dropped their fruit into the grass. Bees buzzed. A stream murmured. Somewhere to the west, in the Elven Grove, the Silvara clan's ancestral tree had sprouted its first new branch in 30 years. Green, strong, alive. And deep within Mournwald, a great spring gushed from a well like a heart to which blood had been restored. Pure green water flowed through underground channels, through the veins of the earth, to small springs, to the roots of trees, to the grass, to the flowers, to the beetles and worms and fish and birds. The circle was closing, slowly, drop by drop, root by root, leaf by leaf. But it was closing. Daniel Ashford sat under an apple tree and spoke with the man who had killed this forest 30 years ago, and he explained to him how to bring it back to life. Not because he had forgiven him, not because he had forgotten, because the earth does not distinguish between the one who poisoned it and the one who heals it. It simply waits. Waits for the one who will come with a shovel, not a sword, with seeds, not fire, with patience, not a command. He came, and the forest came to life. Count von Murnau's army approached Green Hollow. Daniel stepped out unarmed, carrying 2 handfuls of soil and ritual blades. He presented evidence of the spring's poisoning and proposed autonomy for Mournwald. The Count saw the difference between the dead soil of his own land and the living soil of Green Hollow and agreed to negotiations. Under the apple trees that Daniel had planted 3 years earlier, a conversation began, not about war, but about how to heal the land. The great spring came back to life. The circle was complete. The forest returned.